Hello, and welcome to Multi-Story. We believe that cities contain a multitude of stories, and we think that they deserve to be told. I'm Matt. I'm a lover of cities and traveler and explorer of cities. I'm here with my friend Tess, who is a professional urban planner who thinks about cities for a living, and Coletta, who thinks about cities a sort of normal amount. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. Yeah.
Every week we ask, is that fair? And eventually it's not going to be true anymore. So, first of
Yeah,
all, Tess,
there's
how's the
there's a, there's a small window where this gets to be your thing, right? Pretty soon you're going to be an expert who thinks about cities all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I think compared to you two, I think about it a normal amount of time. Compared to the rest of the world, it might be a lot.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair, but that's why you're here, right?
Hmm.
Okay, so as these things kind of go, you notice something and it sent you down a rabbit hole, which, if you've watched this channel before, is sort of a theme. Do you want to tee up what it was that you noticed?
Sure, I am going to take us to the city of San Sebastian, Spain.
Ooh, that looks nice. I want to be swimming there. That sounds
Yeah,
not so
this
hot.
is gorgeous. This is San Sebastian. I was there just a few weeks ago. Um, and to orient, um, San Sebastian is on the northern tip of Spain. It's close to the border with France. We're also in Basque country. So I should say the Basque name for the city is Donostia. And as we zoom in here, you can see that the heart of the city is kind of tucked between a bay and a river, and the Pyrenees sort of come down to meet the sea here. And it's just a very beautiful location. I think San Sebastian's pretty well known for its beaches, its food, its Basque culture. It's extremely photogenic. Like it's impossible to not be somewhere beautiful in the city of San Sebastian. Um, but today, in particular, I wanted to talk about something I saw in the old town of the city. And the old town is, it's very charming and lively and full of history. And these are a couple pictures to sort of give you an impression of the character of the old town. Um, but specifically, what caught my eye was um, not the food or the beaches necessarily, but a particular street.
So, when you were visiting here in our little planning WhatsApp group, you sent this video, which was really just this sort of, I should look into that. And then your your caption was, spoiler alert, I looked into it. And so here we are.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm here in the old town of San Sebastian on a cute little street. But if I pan over, you can see I'm actually above the cross street. And if you look down in the distance, you can see another elevated cross street. So what we have here is something kind of interesting that I haven't really seen before, which is a grade separated street grid in an old medieval city. And I'm interested to learn more about it. So it's kind of strange, right? In this old town, more than 1,000 years old, and there's these streets that are crossing north-south above the grade of the east-west streets, right? So what's going on there? Having different elevations and weird things going on with grade, that part is normal, right? Like there's a reason we dig down to find ruins. So this is the Pantheon in Rome, and it's like several meters below the streets and the other buildings. And that's just because the stuff of history and cities just sort of pile up over time, right? So it's not unusual to have like weird grades and things in old cities. And there's places like Seattle, sometimes it's gradual, but sometimes it's more dramatic or intentional. So, if you visit the Seattle Underground, you see where they just decided that they were tired of the flooding and other issues, and they were just going to rebuild the streets on the upper stories of the existing city, and the old city is still down there, right? Like, and you can take a tour of it, and it's kind of crazy. And there was a period of time where they still used the underground while the entrances were up on the upper floors, right? So cities can decide to change grade and stuff like that. And then, I'm sure you've been to Chicago, and there's sort of streets and freight tunnels and pedestrian networks and all these sorts of things intentionally separated from the grade of the surface, of most of the streets. And there's sort of this, pardon the pun, entire subculture of like underground activity in the city. So it's not that there were different grades that was interesting to me, but it's more like, okay, one street's low, one street's high, and how did it get this way? And as I began to look at it, like I couldn't really tell that it was obvious that the street was built first or the buildings were built first, or if there were, I didn't see maybe a ground floor that used to be a basement or a door that used to be a second story window. So I couldn't really figure out why is it like this? Like why are you the way that you are? And there were a couple little clues there. So there's like these stairs in the alley off to the side. So there's this hint that like there is some historic topography here. There's something going on. But I couldn't really put it together.
Coletta, we've noticed this on our travels a little bit. It reminds me of Lisbon, where you're on one level and you're looking down and you cross the street and there's a whole nother street grid below you. Or Naples, I remember, has some of these intersections, so it's pretty interesting. And I'm curious if there's linkages to the background. And Tess, I'm not sure if you looked beyond. You said that the grade separation is pretty normal, but if you looked on, if this is like a uniquely San Sebastian phenomenon, or if you've looked beyond it. This looks very similar to Napoli, for instance.
Mm.
Right. So grade separations like we see in Seattle or Chicago or in Rome are normal. What caught my eye in San Sebastian that was different is I couldn't figure out, everything seemed kind of seamless, right? And so when and how did it happen? But also what was interesting to me is that it wasn't just one street, it was multiple streets going down the block, right? So it felt like something more systematic was going on. Like someone decided that every north-south street needed to be up in the air and the east-west street needed to be down on the ground. And these are some pictures of some of the other crossings. So I think that's what stood out to me is you're right. A lot of these older cities, there's stairs and alleys and windy parts and all sorts of creative ways that cities deal with topography. And you can be surprised where you think you're at the bottom of something and you're at the top of something else, right? Like that's part of the fun of exploring a city. In this case, yeah.
In this one, is the cross street like the grade level is at the cross street, and it's just that the street that you're on is, and the buildings that are on that street are subterranean, and then the next street up is actually at ground level. So this is like you're in a trench basically right now.
The street that you're seeing here that we're on is sort of at grade with the other streets. So we're looking west towards the port. And it's the north-south streets up above that are traversing higher. Yeah, I mean, this is part of the puzzle, right? So
Okay.
here is a
Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself.
well, no, your question was my question, right? So here we're on the upper level and on of one of the streets that crosses, and up here, everything looks like it was meant to be at this level, right? There's doors where they're supposed to be. There's nothing. Windows don't look in the wrong place. Doors don't look in the wrong space. It looks like this belongs at this grade. It just so happens that this grade is a story up from the cross direction, right? So that was what was interesting to me. So these multiple elevated crossings, and my curiosity got the better of me, and again, I wanted to figure out why is the street the way that it is, and to answer that, I thought I might find some clues in the history of the city, and if I could determine when the street was built or, maybe the circumstances around that might help me understand what was going on. So let's go back in time, okay. We're going to take a real quick whirlwind trip through several thousand years of history, which I found very interesting, but most of it's not super relevant to the street. So there's,
I'm strapping in my time machine.
yeah, there's evidence of Roman settlement in the area. There was a monastery that existed here before the city did. But sort of the founding proper was in 1180. The King of Navarre applied a charter for a new port because he wanted a new trading port um, to serve Navarrese wool, basically, and avoid the complications of trading through his complicated neighbors. So that was the reason that the city was first founded. The city burned down completely 6 times between 1266 and 1489 when it was rebuilt in stone, which again, I think is not super unusual, right? But after 1489, it wouldn't completely burn again until 1813, which is very important to the story of what's going on with these streets. And, you know, due to a variety of reasons and different changing political circumstances, San Sebastian transitioned in the 16th century from what was mainly a commercial center to sort of a military center and naval base. And there was this tension between the commercial purpose of the street and the military purpose of like defending this area. And that was an ongoing theme that's also relevant for what's going on the street, which I found eventually. The street was conquered by the French several times, 1719, 1794, 1808. And what you see on the screen here, these are some French maps from the conquest in 1719, which are interesting because you can see like the trench lines and sort of how the battle unfolded. But also this is one of the early times where you can see the layout of the streets in the city. And when you look closely at that, you can see that the streets that we're interested in these grade changes don't exist yet. So whatever happened after this, right? And so this is part of this historical exploration and this journey to figure out when the street got the way that it did. The other thing you notice here is that the city's central square doesn't exist yet, and that would also be important for what's going on these streets. So, you know, these multiple invasions and some uprisings and other things, political events sort of put into focus this tension with the city between defense and trade, between being closed and being open, you know, between focusing on the town and its business and focusing on the fortifications and their purpose. And these sort of overarching themes like played directly into this weird street that we found. So this isn't a contemporary map of the city, but it was sort of created from historical records to represent the city in 1715, a few years before that French invasion that we mentioned. And there's a few sort of details here. One, we see that that east-west street doesn't exist yet. So that lower street isn't there. We see that north-south street, there's sort of a wall in the middle. So this could have been like an older fortification wall that was later expanded over time. It's also sort of a sign that there might be some topography here. That wall could be separating different grades or elevations, right? So there's some clues here that there was some grade stuff going on before these streets were built. The other thing we see here is the central square, what is now the Plaza de la Constitución. That doesn't exist yet, but you can see these lighter colored parcels are where it would eventually be built. So this is sort of a snapshot in time that shows us the before picture, before the street got the way that it did.
Does that mean that they did demolition to build the square? Like that they didn't pre-plan that?
Yes, they did. And it's, I'll talk about that a little later. You're right to like clue in on that. There were angry property owners There were calls to delay the project. There were disagreements about compensation. It was like a true 18th century Spanish eminent domain battle, to live with the best of them. Absolutely.
We thought the Americans invented urban renewal, but hold my
Right.
beer.
I'll mention a little bit later, but there is something very familiar and comforting about realizing that like nothing is new under the sun, right? So we're going to jump ahead about 100 years here, and this is sort of a model of what San Sebastian looked like in 1813. So at this time, once again, the French are occupying the city, and this time it's Napoleon. And in 1813, his armies are sort of retreating, they're on their back foot, and a combined army of English and Portuguese are trying to root out the French and sort of drive them out of Spain. But here in San Sebastian, it's very difficult. Like the site is very easy to defend, and the defenders here are very stubborn. It's just a very defensive location. And so the city is under siege for many weeks. And in this map from 1813, you can see these trench lines and fortifications of the besieging army. And eventually the walls were breached and the defenders were overrun, and things did not go well for the people of San Sebastian. So the Allied troops burned the city completely, looted, raped, murdered. That all lasted for 7 consecutive days. And after all of that, there were 2 churches and just a few buildings at the northernmost street in the old town that remained. And that was mostly through luck of like the wind direction that the fire didn't blow their way. And that street where a few buildings were left is now renamed for August 31st, which is the day that the city burned. And after all of that, the population of the city went from around 5,500 down to about 2,500. So
Wow.
about half the
Wow.
population of San Sebastian was killed in this sacking of the city.
And what year are we in again?
This is 1813.
1813. Gotcha. Thank you.
So as I describe what happens next here, I sort of want to project a little bit and with open eyes of what that means. And as I want to look at the next series of events through like a urban planning lens, because that's the perspective I bring. And I'm not suggesting that like war and suffering in 19th century Spain are like in any way equivalent to my experiences as an urban planner at all. But as I learned about what happened to the city, it did all feel very familiar and kind of very modern and very human in a way that really connected me with this story. So after the burning of the city, the remaining residents sort of met in a village in the outskirts of San Sebastian to talk about whether or not they should rebuild, right? The city was almost completely destroyed. And in the past, I've done, some work with disaster recovery planning in communities that have been destroyed by like tornadoes or floods or earthquakes or things like that. And often the very first step and the most important step is where the community meets together to decide, whether to stay or whether to go, right? And this meeting can really shape what comes next for the future of that city and that community. And we have planning meetings. They're often like framed as a community dialogue and a consensus building about the future vision of the community, but that question is always like very pointed after a disaster. So luckily for everyone who loves San Sebastian, the city did decide to rebuild, and once you decide to rebuild, like the next question inevitably becomes like, how should we rebuild? You know, who gets to decide? And not everyone agrees, right? And this is like a very familiar dynamic in a planning context, right? So should priority be given to the remaining property owners, or should we focus, is this an opportunity for like new public projects and new thinking about how the city works? Should the city invest in defensive fortifications, or should it not rebuild the walls at all? You know, who will pay for everything? All of this, the citizens of San Sebastian were grappling with in a way that is very contemporary to conversations that communities have today when they're thinking about the future of their cities. The first question is about, you know, how are we going to pay for this, right? And I like this little anecdote. So the residents appointed a new city council. So the French collaborators were out, and they sent a request to Wellington, who was in charge of the army that sacked the city, and said, hey, can you grant us some money for those who need it most and to help us rebuild? And Wellington, first of all, he's like, no. And then he says, not only no, but like, never call this number again, right? And then he's like, and actually, it wasn't my troops' fault at all. It was the French who sacked the city, and I do not exist. Goodbye, basically. And so, you know, we can imagine this as the failed grant application, right? The moonshot redevelopment project that didn't quite make it through here. They applied for a grant, they were denied. So in November of 1813, a construction assembly was established to oversee the reconstruction of the city, you know, and with this contemporary planning lens, right? We can think of this as like the steering committee of experts and stakeholders who are going to guide the planning process. Again, this feels very familiar. And eventually the city council commissioned Pedro Manuel de Ugartemendia to oversee the reconstruction of the project, right? So they established a steering committee, and now they found a qualified consultant to do the work.
This is the standard urban planning committee chair uniform.
Right, exactly. You know, every urban planner has a feathered hat when they need to speak with authority on planning topics. So a little bit about Pedro. You know, he was a Basque architect. And 10 years prior to this, he was named inspector of roads for the province, and he worked on different projects around the province, both like roads and buildings. So he's an expert. He's also has local knowledge and relationships. This is like a very sensible selection, right? So a few months later, he presented his plan for the city. This is May of 1814. So now we are approaching a year after the city was burned, and this is the plan that he presented. And this is an incredibly innovative and transformative proposal for a city that needed to be reconstructed, you know, basically from scratch. So there's a very sort of logical and orderly grid here. He established a set of like uniform parcel sizes and dimensions to make it easier to navigate development and transfers of property and things like that. There's a number of new plazas and public spaces, in particular, this sort of octagonal plaza in the center of the city with these radiating streets around it. And you might also notice that there are these sort of breezeways or like ventilation alleys like in the interior of the blocks of the city for, you know, double ventilation of these buildings, which is very innovative for the time in terms of, public health and just general livability of the buildings and the city. So there was a lot going on here with this proposal and a lot of potential improvements. Of course, as we might expect, thinking about how planning processes go, this plan was opposed vigorously by the property owners who did not want their parcels to change, even though there was really nothing left of what was there. And ultimately, the city council also rejected this plan. So we cut forward, and there's a model of what was proposed, right? So that could have been the new San Sebastian there with that sort of octagon plaza in the middle. So cut forward almost a year, back to the drawing board. Now it's April 1815, and Ugarte presents a new plan, and this time he has a new partner, Alejo de Miranda, another prestigious Basque architect, right? So we've got some new blood on the team. We got some new ideas, new life and momentum for the project. And here this new plan was presented. And it keeps many of the innovations that he had before in the original plan. So you see those breezeways and you see this logical grid, but it's not quite so drastic, right? So there's some new plazas and things, but this is like a clear compromise between that visionary plan and what existed before, right?
So the property owners didn't like the one, so they had to water it down and become less visionary, less aggressive.
Right. This is the compromise plan, right? A clear compromise that tries to make the city better, but is very much like it was before. We can guess what might happen. The plan was rejected by the city and the residents. Another year passes, and finally in 1816, there are orders for reconstruction to begin. The final plan that is approved is almost identical to the city that was there before. On top of that, the king mandated that the walls and fortifications needed to be reconstructed, in opposition to the interests of some of the city's traders and business people. So the change is bad crowd is ultimately victorious. And I think, again, this is something very relatable that, especially in a disaster recovery situation, there is a very strong impulse to put everything back exactly like it was as soon as possible, right? Like just erase the disaster and put everything back. And that's kind of what happened here. And by this time, like Ugarte, he's sort of like pieced out of this project, and the construction is overseen by other people. This is also a very familiar experience, right? Like this guy just got burnt out on all the BS of this reconstruction, and like his name is in the documents, but he's moved on to other cities and other projects who aren't so difficult to work with, basically. But there are a couple improvements that still make it through to this final plan. So some of the old alleys are still kind of reorganized to try and make the streets a little bit more logical. There's also this new connection between the central square and the port that did not exist before. Another thing that came out of this is there were some like very stringent standards for the quality of the road construction and like design requirements for the quality of the buildings. And so that's like a legacy that's still there today. Like it's a very beautiful city, and it's very harmonious. And that's part of that was it came out of these like design requirements in this plan. Again, a very sort of familiar process.
Did the king want to put the fortifications back because they needed them for actual defensive purposes, or because they were just there and he didn't want to change them?
Right. I think and again, the rabbit hole is deep and I didn't go all the way down. I think in general, the walls and fortifications were a barrier to the growth of the city and trade, so residents didn't want them. But the king wanted a defensible city, right? He wasn't going to lose money on his business, but he might lose the city if he couldn't defend it.
Fair enough.
Well, and it just got destroyed, so I would think they would be really worried about people coming back to do that again. Right?
Right. This is yeah, exactly. It's still recent memory, right?
Mhm.
But I think from the trader's perspective, it's like the residents, it's like, you've made my life more difficult and I have to pay you for that, right? So you can see there's this constant tension and resentment around that. So we go ahead a little bit here. So it's 1823. This is a map of the city 10 years after it was initially burned down. And if we zoom in a little bit, you can, first of all, you can see that like even 10 years after the city was destroyed, maybe half of this city is still rubble. So that's kind of a good reminder that when we see old places, there's like a lot of accumulated history and energy there. The planning and development still takes time, right? So this is 10 years out and they still have a lot of work to do on the city. But you can also see some of the interesting things here. So if we look right here, that is the street that is now grade separated. The east-west street connects from the central plaza out to the port, and at a grade above that, a north-south street connects above. We also see the new arches above the street where it passes through the central square. So all of the things that I got curious about when I was there in person, they now appear here on the map in 1823. So we know when the street was built. We know sort of why it matches exactly with all of its surroundings, right? It was all reconstructed at the same time. The buildings and the streets were all rebuilt together after the 1813 fires. But I still didn't know, like, why exactly is the North-South Street elevated? Like, what was the purpose of doing that? And why doesn't it simply like intersect the new cross street? And I eventually found the answer on this blog of a person who gives walking tours in San Sebastian. And basically the story is that, up until 1813 and the fire, there was a hill there that was as high as like 15 meters. So like a 50-foot hill that was there, a lot of topography. And when Ugartemendia wanted to create this new street connection, this east-west connection between the plaza and the port, it had to go through this hill. So there was a lot of dirt that needed excavating. And also we wanted to raise up the plaza because it, collected water and it flooded sometimes. So there was moving some dirt around. But again, mentioning this like tension between commerce and defense, the soldiers in the fortress north of the city needed to access the fortifications that are on the southern end of the wall there. And previously they had used the street was there as a direct line. They moved like artillery and ammunition in between them. And basically they didn't want their transportation route for their military connection between these fortifications to just like get stuck in the intersection of this new busy trade street between the plaza and the port. So there was already a hill there. The street was already up high on this hill. So they sort of just kept the street up there, arched it over the new street, which is sort of dug below. And that allowed the soldiers to move north-south without any interference of all of the business activity on the east-west street. Okay, so that was sort of the answer to that story. And here's sort of a picture of that movement between those fortifications. And if we look here, we can see on the left is the elevated street that the soldiers would use to move equipment. And on the right is sort of in the same spot, but looking down below on the commercial street between the port and the central square. Okay, so that explains that one. But what about the other arches, the other elevated areas that I saw? And now that we understand the rebuilding of the city, it's pretty straightforward to understand. So basically, as the central square was rebuilt, these arches were also built to sort of unify the architecture of the square. And so there were two more of those arches on the street because the street entered and exited this square as part of this new design. And there, in the old town, I walked past this when I was there. There's like a design school, which I found interesting. And I looked at some of the stuff they had, outside. But later I found this research paper from that design school who talked about the history of this plaza. And I mentioned before, it was this public process to create a new public amenity. And because of that, all of the buildings and structures that face this plaza are publicly owned. They were sort of eminent domain or the equivalent back in
Interesting.
1715, and they were reconstructed as public buildings as much as we might do today, as a pretense for the taking, right? If we're going to take something for public use, we shouldn't just give it to another private owner. A very common discussion that's had about planning in the United States, say. So here, the public owned these buildings, and it rented out the stalls for vendors and things like that, and sort of leased these spaces. And so the entirety of the square was a public responsibility. But it wasn't just like a market plaza. This became the city's bullfighting ring. And so here you see these public buildings organized like grandstands for spectators to watch bullfighting, and you can see people on the balconies. And you also see people sitting in sort of bleachers on these arches over these roads, right? So it's almost like a stadium infrastructure component built into this plaza. And the arches that I saw were part of the circulation for that stadium. And, if you look closely on this picture, if you look at the above the window, like the yellow transom above each of the windows, they each have little numbers. And those numbers were the stadium section that we went to. You would buy a ticket for window like 154, and you would go to your window, and that would be your spot where you watched.
That's wild.
So it's this public plaza / rented commercial space / public arena, and it all is sort of multifunction together.
So
and
those bleachers were temporary, presumably. So there was this big transformational effort that they did to configure this and set it up for the big exhibitions, the bullfights and stuff like that. Is that what it seems like?
Just like the same way that you might put up, bleachers for an event or a speech or a parade or something when they have
or like a
bullfights.
stage in a park.
Right, exactly. They just had, the crew come out and put up the seats and sell the tickets, and it's all public buildings, and they just rent it forever, whatever public purpose they want. And this is that picture from before it was built, and you can see the properties that were taken. And this is later when you can see those spaces sort of carved out. And it's a bit of a tangent here, but I mentioned this was also sort of a very familiar planning process, right? So the creation of this plaza, although it's not directly related to those elevated streets I saw, here's just a little tidbit of the process. There were many delays. There were many complaints and appeals to the king and counter appeals to different levels of government to move the project forward, to try and halt it, right? We can imagine a local constituency today who is opposing a public project because of the impact it will have on their property or their perceived quality of life and all of the steps they go through to sort of delay it. And here we see record of these property owners complaining that no one consulted them about what was going on. And even though there was analysis conducted, they don't know anyone who participated in that analysis. And these buildings aren't getting replaced for public purpose. They're just building other private buildings for other people to profit from, right? Like you could put these quotes in a newspaper article today about a hot button planning topic and they would fit no problem at all. So
I feel like we could have another show called like NIMBYs of history.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. And I think that's my big takeaway here, right? Like at first I was interested by this elevated street and I did find the answer and it's interesting and it gave me a reason to sort of look at all of the history. But mostly I found this like story of city planning that, even though, 300 years ago and then 200 years ago, very, very familiar. The same types of conversations, the same types of challenges, the same process to try and work through these challenges and try to make the place better for everyone. And that was my journey.
The common thread there is like, if leaders don't push past the naysayers and have a vision, then we never get nice things that are still being enjoyed and admired hundreds of years later.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you could take that away, right? At a certain point, like the king issued stop orders, like do not build this plaza, et cetera, et cetera. And like, oops, the building's already torn down. It's a very like Chicago daily millennial art.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Like that's not necessarily ideal, right? But I think there's other lessons here too, which is like, even though the citizens rejected the bold and innovative plan, and even though they rejected the compromise plan, like the city recovered, it thrived, good things happened. Like it's maybe they didn't happen in the way that people wanted in the lifetimes of the people who envisioned them. But when you're as a planner, it's good to know that just because something I work on just absolutely goes down in flames doesn't mean that it's lost forever.
One of the things that I noticed in this is that the people charged with the sort of imagination of the city plan were architects. And this idea that like the urban planning profession, and Tess, you probably know off the top of your head, like when was that profession born and the distinction from the civic level and the structure level? Because architects often can't see far enough past their nose. I mean, that's sort of the, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that's like a cliche between like planners and planners hate architects, hate engineers because of the scope of their work, right? And that they're not considering one another's challenges and shortcomings in context. So how's that fit in terms of like, architects were urban planners because we didn't have this more specific definition at that time. And it was architects that designed the city.
Well, in one sense, like city planning didn't exist the same way. I think that's true. But in another sense, Ugarte Mentia was an architect, but he was also the chief road builder, right? It was the same job. The architect was the person who laid out and designed the roads, and the person who built public buildings and was also involved with deciding like how the city should function, right? All of that was a single discipline, which makes sense because it's all related and it's the same sorts of issues and conversations that we all have together, but we're more highly segmented and specialized in that.
Mm-hmm. Maybe they were better off having generalists. They could get more buy-in.
I mean, I dare say, Jose Q citizen in San Sebastian did not have as much say about what would happen as someone might today, right? Like,
yeah,
it was definitely top
so.
down, like, and sometimes it was top down from the king, who doesn't care about what's happening on your street, right? But through all of that, I saw the same types of struggles, the same types of conversations, right? The details changed, but like, what do we want to do with the future? How much do we want to change or not change? How do we balance needs of different stakeholders? That's the part that's universal, right? And I think that's sort of, to me, the sort of magic of it all.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of amazing how the comments you could read them in the comment section of a social media post today, and it would be almost word for word with new language.
I mean, I could make a San Sebastian Twitter profile and just like tweet real time all of my complaints about the master planning process of the rebuilding of the city, and it would fit right in, right?
Tweets from 1815. I like it.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to see that.
That would be a fun side project. The only other thing I noticed is that the adoption of the grid coming in like in the mid 1800s or whenever. It's interesting. So when cities burned down, they got rebuilt with grids because that was the cool way to do it. So Lisbon famously, its like center is a kind of a boring grid where the adjacent neighborhoods that didn't burn down are like the labyrinth of kind of interlocking streets. So it's really interesting. Like you can see in history, like when this is just the convention had arrived.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that is looking forward. Like it is a rational approach, trying to solve new types of problems and a more modern lifestyle and economy. Some of it's also looking backward as well. So Ugarte Mentia's new design partner was known as like a neoclassicist, right? So like if geometry was good enough for the Greeks and Romans, it's good enough for us. So that was part of it too, right? There was an order and symmetry to things, and a grid lent itself to that sort of perspective. Makes sense.
I'm curious if you think that it's easier when you're building things from scratch to do it in a grid, as opposed to, I would assume that a lot of like European cities that have super windy, weird streets, like sort of built up very slowly over time, as opposed to some big project like this where it's like we're doing this whole thing, or even in the United States where people are like coming in and like building a city from scratch.
Right. And there's different pros and cons. We've talked about that in some of our other episodes about some of the pros and cons of a grid. I think in a case like rebuilding after a disaster, but it's similar in like a railroad town, is a grid is really good when you need to build very quickly and uniformly, and it's very
Yeah.
flexible in terms of the transfer of property, right? Like it's easy to like the parceling of it is very straightforward and predictable, and when you need to grow, you grow in the same way you did before, and you sort of figured out the function and orientation of the neighborhoods, and you can sort of replicate those as you go, right? Like that's one of the benefits of a grid. I think in somewhere here like San Sebastian, I think there's some of that going on. Some of it is just a pretense at like neoclassical order, right? So, and we can debate how much value that brings to the function of the city. But also, I just think that like this was a time where like little streets and narrow alleys weren't like quirky, unique spaces to explore in our city that has other modes of function, right? These were like places where people couldn't do business, where disease festered, where, people were not living well. And the, it's a similar instinct to like Haussmann bulldozing half of Paris, right? Like we're going to rebuild it in a way that solves all of these problems that our cities have had for many generations.
Or urban renewal in the mid-century, mid 20th century United States. So those structures that exist at the elevated level, I assume that they have frontages at both levels. Like those buildings are on both levels and have ground floor activations on both levels.
Yeah, they have.
Are you saying that the streets are both levels? Or are you? I'm not sure if I'm understanding your question.
Well, they would exist on a corner.
Yeah, a lower street crosses the higher street. At that corner, a building will have entrances on the lower street and up on the higher street.
So you're like on perpendicular sides.
Yeah.
Because the building wall of the higher street, there's no like underbridge passageway. That's a solid building on the lower.
No, yeah, it was a hill. So they left the hill there. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Cleta, any other last questions or thoughts?
I don't think so. It's pretty interesting.
I really want to. So we didn't make it to San Sebastian. We were in Bilbao, and Cleta got a little sick, so we hung out in Bilbao. Well, we were planning to hang out in Bilbao the whole time, but we didn't make a run for.
We were only going for like a day anyway.
Yeah, well, definitely.
But now Matt's obsessed with going.
have the pinchos, the Basques tapas. Enjoy the beaches. The buildings are gorgeous. The streets are very pleasant. Shady trees, bike infrastructure everywhere. But also maybe go and take a look at that funny little street and think about how planning is the same forever.
Yeah. I will complain. If I notice something I don't like, I will let everyone know I was not consulted.
Exactly.
I'm sure you will.